Okay, so today we're going to look at the colony of Pennsylvania's role in the great imperial rivalry that had emerged between Britain and France by the mid-18th century, leading to the French and Indian War, which from 1756 was merged with the global 7 Years' War. This, of course, was a conflict that essentially set the stage for the American Revolution and American independence. But before we go into that, I just want to give you a brief historical context for the 7 Years' War and why by 1754 France and Britain were engaged in the preliminary blows of this world-changing conflict. Okay, so looking at the map here, we can identify the French and British colonies in North America. France also possessed the Louisiana Territory, in addition to that territory you could see there broadly defined as Canada or New France. The Louisiana Territory extended west of the Mississippi and north of the Rio Grande. Now, French control in this region was, I'd say, a nominal control because there were very few settlers and the region was barely explored. Indeed, the northwest of the territory wasn't explored at all by Europeans. And this particular region, the Louisiana territories, would swap hands between the Spanish and the French a few times before Napoleon finally sold it to the United States, the famous or infamous, I guess you could say, Louisiana Purchase of 1803. That entire Louisiana region was sold for the bargain price of $15 million. As a matter of interest, and if you want to pause the lecture after this question, Spain also had interests in North America. Can you spot which these were on the map? Some very old and notable by today's standards territories, which again would become embroiled in the Great War for Empire, as the 7 Years' War was called. Now, as I've mentioned, the French also possessed modern-day Canada, or a significant portion along the east of modern-day Canada. They created the colonies of Acadia and Quebec, which collectively, as I referred to a few moments ago, was known as New France. However, the British had taken over Acadia in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, and they renamed it Nova Scotia. When we think of the French colonies collectively, it's important to remember that they were very small in terms of population numbers. In fact, there were 60,000 habitants in New France by 1750. But this worked to their advantage because historically they were able, or better able, to forge alliances with Native American groups. Many French Canadians, for example, lived among Indian peoples, the famous coureurs de bois, and through this complex diplomatic and blood network, the colony was able to project a power that belittled and belied its sparse population base and economic weaknesses. Indeed, by the mid-1700s, France was moving south from Canada towards its Louisiana territory, and it hoped to join the two significantly through the strategically vital Ohio Valley. And by doing so, and as again you'll see from the map, they would hem the British colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America. And again, if you want to pause the lecture at this point just to get a sense of the geography of this conflict, please do so at this point. Okay, so this second map will give you an indication of Britain's North American territories, and again it's another view of the same, I suppose it's fair to say, but this time with a focus on the British colonies. Britain's American Empire consisted most famously of those 13 colonies that would later form the United States, beginning with Virginia in 1607 and spreading from Georgia in the south to Maine in the north. The latter at that time was part of Massachusetts. Now, I don't want to name all of these colonies, but Pennsylvania was very much one of them, and on this particular map you can see the dates in which they were established. But Britain's American empire went far beyond these 13 colonies. It also consisted of Newfoundland and, from 1713, Nova Scotia, which you'll remember was formerly French Acadia. After the French and Indian War, Quebec would be incorporated into the British North American Empire. And Britain would also take East and West Florida from Spain in 1763, but ceded them back again 20 years later at the end of the American War of Independence. Again, if you so wish, at this point, pause the recording and have a look at the map. Now, wars between the French and British in North America happened fairly regularly and often followed conflicts in Europe. However, as North America became a more strategic concern for both the French and British governments, this began to change. The growing importance of the colonies was clear in the way that the War of the Austrian Succession started. Now, this war began as the War of Jenkins' Ear because of an incident involving Robert Jenkins, the captain of a privateering ship called Rebecca, which was boarded by a Spanish Coast Guard vessel near Havana, Cuba in 1731. Now, the Spanish vessels who boarded the Rebecca found no illegal loot, but nonetheless cut Jenkins' ear off and supposedly told him to take it back to England to show that Spain, or what Spain, had in mind for the English king, George II. And Jenkins indeed pickled his ear and took it home. And in 1739 he was invited to Parliament by anti-Spanish MPs, and when he showed the chamber his ear in a jar, there was an irresistible clamour for war. Even so, while the War of Jenkins' Ear began over a dispute in the colonies, it turned into the War of the Austrian Succession, a European dynastic conflict rather than an imperial war. Only after the 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle did the British develop a blue water policy of imperial conflict and expansion, and thus the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, which grew from the French and Indian War in North America, which lasted from 1754 to 1760, was really the first imperial war. And as a result, it was also the first world war in the sense that it was a global conflict fought on virtually every continent across the globe. So the French and Indian War began in the forests of the American Northwest. The 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which had settled the earlier War of the Austrian Succession, had left open the question of whether the Ohio River Valley in particular, a crucial strategic region, belonged to the British or the French. The Ohio Valley, in short, for the British colonies, would allow them to expand into America's interior, and it was for this purpose that the French wanted to cut off their numerically superior rivals. Remember, 60,000 French habitants in Canada versus around 1.25 million Anglo-American colonists spread across these 13 colonies. So to do this, in subsequent years, the French built a line of forts south from the Great Lakes and Canada and the Great Lakes. The building of Fort Duquesne, a map of which you can see on the PowerPoint slide, at the forks of the Ohio River near present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's an outline available, or there is an outline of this fort in Pennsylvania, right in the city centre, I suppose, even to this day, where it once stood. The building of this fort alarmed British colonial authorities, so much so that Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia, and I would say here that the Ohio territories were a disputed region between Pennsylvania and Virginia, amongst other English colonies, Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia dispatched 22-year-old George Washington to demand a French withdrawal from the Ohio Valley in October of 1753. The French refused, and colonial forces began attacking French forces the following year. Now, the first phase of the British campaign went horrendously badly. George Washington surrendered his Fort Necessity, aptly named Fort Necessity, to the French and their Indian allies on the 4th of July 1754. Now here's a question for you, and again pause the lecture and think about this and maybe write down an answer. What did George Washington go on to become, and why is July the 4th a significant date in US history? It's a remarkable coincidence. Anyway, the following year, General Edward Braddock, a British regular commander, tried to capture Fort Duquesne, but lost his own life and those of 814 men at the Battle of the Wilderness on the 9th of July 1755. The French and their Indian allies lost fewer than 50 men, and it was largely a Native American victory. In this battle, most of the French forces consisted of allied Native Americans, including the Lenni Lenape and other formerly Pennsylvania-based Indian tribes who'd been very much alienated by the English colonists, including the sons of William Penn, who had, of course, made this fraudulent walking purchase with the natives earlier in the 18th century. So in response to Braddock's defeat, the British responded with an act of ethnic cleansing that was a disgrace even by the low standards of the time. They expelled the French Acadians from Nova Scotia in September and October of 1755. Now, some of these Acadians went to France, but many of them moved to French Louisiana, and it's here where they're known to this day as Cajuns. Braddock's defeat, the defeat at the Battle of the Wilderness, also inspired a formal declaration of war by King George II in May 1756, hence the beginning date of the 7 Years' War. And please don't conflate the French and Indian War, which began in 1754, with the global 7 Years' War, which began in 1756. Now, for the British, things got worse before they got better. On the 9th of August 1757, John Campbell, Lord Loudon, deployed himself and a large portion of the British army in an ill-fated attempt to capture Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, abandoning New York State to a very small abandoning New York State and leaving a very small British force in defence of that colony. And consequently, the French advancing south from Canada down Lake Champlain and onto Lake George captured Fort William Henry. General Montcalm, who led the French forces, launched this lightning strike. And you might remember the capture of Fort William Henry from the film The Last of the Mohicans, which depicts this particular event, and of course the so-called massacre of Fort William Henry, in which 60 or 70 British Americans were killed by France's Indian allies after a surrender and before the French could becalm them. This so-called massacre, it was more a consequence, I think, of European European and Native American martial and cultural clashes. Was massively exaggerated in British North America to build an anti-Indian sentiment, and it was made famous in James Fenimore Cooper's novel The Last of the Mohicans, and as I say, even more so, the 1992 Daniel Day-Lewis film, which was based on this book. Things did turn for the British in their favour, and after the accession of William Pitt in June of 1757, this was notable. Pitt put a lot of money and indeed men behind the war effort, and from this point there was little the French could do. The French army in North America was top class and it was well led, but there were simply too few French colonists and indeed soldiers, and France's Indian allies, certainly after the massacre of Fort William Henry, and they were heavily criticised by Montcalm, were unwilling to take to the field to take on the British in set piece battles, and hence the French ultimately were unable to resist. If we think of the global strategic position, France as well at this time was very much distracted by the war in Europe, where it was fighting Prussia, and great battles in Europe, and this meant that the British were free using their navy to pick off French colonies around the world. And indeed, in the second half of 1758 in North America, British regular soldiers, colonial militia, and their Cherokee Indian allies captured a series of French forts, including Fort Duquesne, the site of one of Britain's most disastrous military catastrophes back in 1755. The British gradually pushed the French back, and their domination was completed with the French surrender of Montreal on the 8th of September 1760, which followed the capture of Quebec in 1759, Quebec City, and finally Detroit fell to the British on the 29th of October 1760. At the Peace of Paris 1763, France recognised British possession of Quebec, and indeed what was New France. The French retained the Louisiana Territory after the war, but ceded all their claims east of the Mississippi River to Britain. And as I've mentioned, Spain ceded East and West Florida to Britain in the same treaty. Okay, I'm just advancing through some of those dates there on the PowerPoint before we look at Pennsylvania and the 7 Years' War. Now, Pennsylvania had been at the centre of the conflict from the very beginning. The Ohio Valley, which was the British colony's gateway to the interior of North America, included large tracts of land claimed by Pennsylvania and its neighbour and rival, Virginia. Now, Virginia's, and by extension Britain's, claim to the disputed lands of the Ohio Valley could be traced to the first and third charters of the Virginia Company. In 1609 and later 1612, these decreed that all lands constituting the colony of Virginia would be inalienably the territory of England. Any future territories discovered, stretching from Cape Comfort, Virginia, to the furthermost western sea of the North American continent, would also form an undisputable element of England's newfound realm. As a region dominated by the land-intensive tobacco crop, new lands for cultivation were in fact essential for Virginia, hence the enthusiasm of their speculators in pressing claims to territory there. Now, in contrast to Virginia, which was established for its potential mercantile benefits, at least initially, Pennsylvania had originally, and as you'll remember, been founded, though not exclusively, by the pacifist Quakers, a group who initially sought freedom from religious persecution in the Old World. You also know that the colony quickly proved to be a successful venture, and by the 1750s, its prosperous economy was based largely on domestic agriculture and an embryonic industrial base that was concerned with the manufacture of textiles, among other things. By the mid-18th century, Pennsylvania was basically a middle-class colony, with limited deference to the small upper class. A writer in the Pennsylvania Journal in 1756 summed it all up when he said, "The people of this province are generally of the middling sort, and at present pretty much upon a level. They are chiefly industrious farmers, artificers, or men of trade. They enjoy in and are fond of freedom, and the meanest among them thinks that he has the right to civility from the greatest." Now, as you may remember, initially Pennsylvania and its governing class, dominated by the proprietary Penn family, didn't participate in the land grabs that were typical of other English colonies like Virginia, and therefore they'd enjoyed a more peaceful coexistence with local native tribes. Nonetheless, as time progressed and the attractions of the Quaker colony became widespread knowledge in Europe, the province saw a large influx of peoples who didn't necessarily share the Quakers' tolerant and pacifist religious theology. Accordingly, by the 1720s, Pennsylvania had required further lands and resources to accommodate their new, hopeful, and ambitious young colonists. Just as Virginia would quickly realize, access to such territories depended upon establishing a presence in the Ohio region, and Pennsylvania, with numerous internal demands for more land to accommodate its new migrants, or immigrants I should say, in addition to a burgeoning class of merchants who saw the region as an opportunity to exploit the lucrative Anglo-Indian fur trade that existed there, and of course those who foresaw immense land speculation possibilities, was determined to press its claim to the Ohio territories. And this, as I've mentioned, would naturally bring it into dispute with its neighbours, including Virginia and New York. So, this race for land was between the British colonies themselves as well as the French, and it was this tinderbox which exploded with George Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity in 1754. Okay, thinking about politics and war in Pennsylvania. Now, as pacifists ideologically opposed to war, the Quakers who dominated the Pennsylvania Assembly had a pretty hard time of things, though their resilience did prevent a total collapse of their influence. The 7 Years' War harbingered many internal political crises in the colony, as well as great bloodshed and turmoil for frontier communities, which were devastated by French and Indian raiding parties. Despite being renowned as one of the more prosperous colonies of British America, Pennsylvania and its Quaker Assembly often found themselves subject to the barbs of British military commanders in particular, who were sent to the colonies to raise troops and monies for the war effort, only to find their requests gridlocked by constitutional quandaries and moral objections. General Edward Braddock in particular was notably scathing of Pennsylvanians, saying during his campaign that, to quote, they had promised nothing and had performed everything. Luckily, Benjamin Franklin, a rising member of the Pennsylvania Assembly, was able to mollify the general somewhat by helping to supply horses, carriages and food to British troops, while he convinced the Assembly to provide gift parcels containing chocolate, wine and other luxuries to British officers who were performing their duty in a country that was really bereft of such necessities. And these things, by the way, were only made available to officers. If you were an enlisted man, none of these applied. Now, British perceptions were, I think it's fair to say, rather unfair, as the Pennsylvania Assembly often did vote significant monies for different war efforts. £40,000 local currency was in fact eventually raised to support Braddock's expedition against Fort Duquesne in the Ohio Valley. The problem was that the Quakers' moral objections to war limited what they would consent to and what they would consent to spending. And this naturally didn't include, for instance, military or warlike efforts and campaigns. The colony was also beset by internal constitutional struggles, with the proprietor of the colony, Thomas Penn, and his governor, in 1755, Robert Hunter Morris, both wishing to expand their own authority at the expense of the Quaker-dominated assembly. One of these constitutional schisms can be seen between the conflict between Penn and his governor and the assembly over the raising of taxes to pay for supplies earmarked for the Braddock campaign. Now, to raise money, the Quaker-dominated assembly would have to levy taxes on the local population, but they would only agree to do so if the colony's proprietor, and remember he was an Anglican, not a Quaker, obviously it's Thomas Penn, acknowledged that his own personal estate should also be part of this levy. Now, Penn believed that his own estates should be exempt from any form of taxation. Because of this conflict of personal interests, there were thus huge delays in providing supplies for the British Army, and despite Benjamin Franklin's efforts, it left a great deal of resentment between all of the parties involved. Now, for the Quakers, this constitutional struggle, an internal constitutional struggle, and don't forget the Quakers had controlled the assembly, it was merely a portent of the difficulties that were to come. Indeed, in the wake of General Edward Braddock's disastrous defeat at the hands of a smaller French and Indian, largely Indian, you remember, force on July the 9th, 1755, the frontiers of Pennsylvania especially were at the mercy of raiding parties who attacked with a regularity and ferocity that killed thousands of settlers and sent many others fleeing for their lives. The native tribes who declared against the British in the early stages of the war included some of those groups who had found refuge in the colony in its formative years, such as the Delaware. However, and as again you'll remember, as the British colonies expanded territorially, these tribes had been pushed into the Ohio and were now facing further encroachments in this region. For various reasons, including the incompetence of British-American Indian diplomacy, once friendly tribes during the 7 Years' War were largely aligned to the French. Now, as we've seen from the outset of the war, significant division existed among Pennsylvania Quakers as to whether they should take any role in the defence of the colony. Some Quaker leaders objected that taking any role in the defence of the colony would violate their vows as pacifists. Others, who viewed support for defence as within the Quaker mission of spreading peace, may have been influenced by calls for aid from beleaguered frontier communities who were beset by growing Indian raids. Most Quakers serving in the Pennsylvania Assembly did then support appropriating money for defence purposes between the fall of 1755 and summer of 1756. However, as it became clear that the conflict would last longer than initially anticipated, some grew more reticent to vote money for military measures. Now, by March of 1756, things had reached something of a head, as frontiers were plagued by French Indian raids and indeed the death and destruction they wrought. Backcountry German and Scotch-Irish settlers who had taken refuge in Philadelphia demanded action. Governor Morris and his council considered declaring war on the Delaware and Shawnees and offering scalp bounties. The Quakers resisted the pull towards war, but the proprietary leaders, sensing an opportunity, capitalized on the situation by criticizing the Quakers for not fully implementing militia laws to defend the colony on account of their pacifism, and indeed for failing to properly conduct native diplomacy. In late March of 1756, a meeting of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Ministers and Elders was marred by an incident that reflected widespread support for war. Frontiersmen from Gnadenhutten pulled a wagon containing 2 or 3 bodies of their comrades through the streets of Philadelphia, and behind the wagon tramped a mob of livid locals who cursed both Indians and Quakers. This is what you would call, I think, direct process. Very vivid, very gruesome, direct action trying to force the hand of the Quakers. Now, as historian Peter Silver has argued, this era of bloodshed marked a more ruthless approach to American Indians, not only on the part of Pennsylvanians, but British Americans more widely. Every supposed backcountry massacre fed an anti-Indian sublime which served to other indigenous peoples. Increasingly, this took on a racist overtone as Indians became equated with murderous savagery and wanton cruelty. Needless to say that the anti-Indian dialogue developed during the 7 Years' War fed into the conflicts and depopulation of native peoples from tribal homelands as the newly independent United States eventually pushed further and further westwards. Politically, 1757 events shook up the Pennsylvania Assembly. 6 Quakers resigned, an action that provided opposition groups an opportunity to dislodge the Quaker majority in the fall 1756 elections. This they did, but although the Quakers thus lost control of the assembly, they remained the colony's most dominant power bloc. They were coveted by competing interests within the assembly. The proprietary interest, and indeed the British government, also sought to extend their own influence within the American colonies as a whole, and this included at various times coveting the assistance of the Quakers. The Treaty of Eton, which concluded on October the 26th, 1758, resulted in many Lenape, Mingo and Shawnee tribes in the Ohio Valley abandoning the French. And I think the capture of Fort Duquesne and the assertion of British military supremacy in North America was a key factor in this. Remember, the French were struggling after 1757 to supply their native allies because of the British naval blockade of New France, and that was something that was exacerbated by the terrible corruption of the Canadian government. Indians thus realised that if they were to survive as independent nations, for that's what they saw themselves, then they needed to realign their interests with the British, or indeed remain neutral. So this collapse of native support had made it possible for the British to capture Fort Duquesne and indeed the Ohio Valley. The fighting on the Pennsylvania frontier came to a close in the late autumn of 1758 when a massive army of more than 6,000 men under the command of Brigadier General John Forbes seized Fort Duquesne without a struggle. Now, Indian hostilities didn't end there, however. Shortly after the end of the French and Indian Wars, angry Indians attempted to drive the British out of the Ohio country in Pontiac's Rebellion. Briefly, Pontiac's Rebellion was a war waged by the Indians of the Great Lakes region against the British after the French and Indian War. The Indians, who you'll remember had formed alliances with the defeated French during the conflict, were dissatisfied with their treatment by or from British officials. Unlike their French allies, British officials entrusted with Indian relations refused to offer gifts to tribal leaders, gifts such as guns, gunpowder and ammunition, vital for hunting and supplying local peoples with food. Furthermore, English settlers began displacing Indians from their land. While French settlers and Indians seemed to live in relative harmony, the sheer number of English settlers that descended on the region post-war prompted many Indians to support conflict. The war was named after Pontiac, chief of the Ottawa tribe. Indians from many tribes including the Ottawa, Ojibwa, Shawnee, Miami, Huron, Seneca, Potawatomi participated in the uprising. So the war saw heavy fighting once again blight western Pennsylvania. However, native forces were defeated in the Battle of Bushy Run, and this really marked the end of their resistance. The conflict lasted until 1766 when the British made peace. During the war, the king of the time, King George III, issued the infamous Proclamation Act. This act barred Americans from any settling west of the Appalachians and reserved that territory for Native Americans. Fighting between Native Americans and Americans in present-day Pennsylvania continued in Lord Dunmore's War and the Revolutionary War, and Native American tribes would cease to pose a military threat to European settlers in Pennsylvania after the conclusion of the Northwest Indian War in 1795, just to give you a sense of where things would end. Going back to the 7 Years' War then, this had left a transformative mark on Pennsylvania. In addition to political conflict and upheaval, the devastation of frontier communities and the loss of thousands of lives interfered with commerce, amongst other things. Before the outbreak of hostilities, ships from the Philadelphia area traded up and down the eastern seaboard as well as internationally. Part of this trade had always been illegal, And during the conflict, the Pennsylvania colonial authorities made greater efforts to suppress the illicit trade with the French through neutral ports of the West Indies. Now, the panic caused during Pontiac's rebellion had seen angry frontiersmen known as the Paxton Boys march toward Philadelphia, threatening to overthrow the government. And this had further eroded the political influence of the Quakers, who became increasingly associated with strict pacifism. Opponents accused the Quaker leadership not only of failing to protect the colonists during the French and Indian War and Pontiac's rebellion or uprising, but also of aiding the Indians. And various French and Indian War related controversies led some rising political figures such as Benjamin Franklin to call for Pennsylvania to dispose of the proprietors and become a royal colony. This was linked to that whole issue of proprietary exemption from taxation while simultaneously demanding increased revenue from the local populace. The resulting political awareness among groups outside of the proprietary interest would become a power force in the protest against British tax policy in the run-up to the American Revolution. It is therefore clear to us historians that many of the schisms evident in the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania as elsewhere really set the stage for the breakup of the British Empire in North America and the birth of a new nation, the United States of America. Okay, once again, a large amount of ground covered in a short space of time. Yes, the French and Indian War was transformative, not just for Pennsylvania, but I think for British North America and indeed the Anglo-American relationship more widely. I really do feel it set the stage for the American Revolution, and that of course would lead to the birth of an independent United States, initially United Colonies of America, and that is what we'll be examining again through the prism of Pennsylvania in the next lecture. Thank you very much for listening.